As the old traditional streets began to be overcrowded with vehicles and people, modernist architects and planners started to think of a solution: how to fit everything into the same footprint, but at the same time not obstruct vehicle travel and create somewhat good environment for pedestrians. The answer would be vertical separation, and thus a very popular principle was born. Principle that had and has many names, some of which you probably heard: three-dimensional, vertical, or volumetric city, or streets in the sky. In our city of Altengrad, we will stay in the center, where a huge construction site popped up last time. That will be the place where we will create the largest single building in the whole city, a huge modernist shopping and office center that will include some vertical elements. And in the meantime, let's explore the topic of streets in the sky in real life. First, with some basic explanation, then we will dive into numerous examples from around the world, continued with more detailed look at Central European region with some really interesting never-built plans, and together with that, we will discuss the practicality and reality. So just from the introduction, the idea is crystal clear: create a separate place for pedestrians, vertically divided from other levels that are reserved only for either cars or some public transport. This is a drawing made in 1913 of New York, which illustrates that the basic idea of building multiple levels is nothing new. On the contrary, it is one of those urban solutions that is engineeringly logical. It is basically that heavily technical or scientific solution that attempts to create perfect living environment where things are efficient and optimized for the average human. In other words, utopian. From a certain point of view at least. Fast forward into the post-war period, roughly around the 1950s to 70s. Modernism ruled the urban design theories, and one of the main points, as we discussed many times before in the series, was the departure from classic street, classic squares, and dividing city functions. Streets in the sky approach fits perfectly into that. Let's first start outside of Central Europe. It is no surprise that streets in the sky were heavily used in countries where modernism was very strong, such as Great Britain and France, but also Americas and overall in any place with modernist projects, so pretty much everywhere on every continent. In London, there was an idea for a separate elevated pedestrian network, or pedway, from just after the war. The original plan was to create a very extensive system of paths connecting the entire city of London. Developers were required to include parts of the pedway in their projects, so eventually the system would interconnect. That did not happen, as City of London was also full of old blocks, so the new development sometimes did not touch to form a connection. That eventually led to some partial demolitions when it became clear that it's quite literally a dead end. But in the city, there is the Barbican Estate project, which is a huge brutalist development from the 60s and 70s, where streets in the sky are quite clearly used. And not just streets, but we might call them plazas in the sky. But it's not just an upper level covering the ground. It is a proper multi-level area with various openings below, plazas and corridors connected by stairs, so very literally creating that three-dimensional public area. But not just to connect residential blocks, but also to provide vertical commercial areas and leisure, so the space actually somewhat works as a proper public space. Interestingly, the Barbican Estate also shows remnants of the pedway, as we can see with the numerous little bridges going across the neighboring streets into the surrounding blocks that have nothing to do with the estate itself. In the UK, there are many other projects with this principle applied. Many others have already been demolished. Some that were not are now under various historical protections. Let's go back in time a little to late 1950s to maybe see how the principle started to be employed. This is the Park Hill Estate in Sheffield. At first glance, an ordinary modernist housing project, but the streets in the sky are hidden inside. Well, that just makes them ordinary hallways that are nothing special, right? Well, not quite. Every third floor has an open deck that runs through all of the buildings as they are connected by bridges. Because of the sloped terrain, apart from the topmost deck, all decks can be accessed by just freely walking or driving into them. The decks are wide enough to apparently fit the typical British milk truck that could just circle around the whole estate inside the buildings. The basic idea was that you would not even need to leave the building to visit your friends, chat with neighbors from other parts of the estate, and even shop and go to a pub on the commercial levels. It also means that, unlike ordinary residential buildings, there is nothing like the frequent single entrance to one staircase. The entrances here are only few, but you can use any one to reach the whole complex. It was exactly that engineering solution, certainly in terms of architecture, but perhaps a little in terms of social engineering as well. There will be some links in the description to point you towards some further reading if you're interested. Similarly to the never-completed pedway idea for the City of London, Calgary in Canada in the 1960s decided to build its own streets in the sky in the downtown. But here, it succeeded in forming a network, and it's apparently the longest in the whole world today, with 16 kilometers or 10-mile length and 86 bridges over the streets. A notable example of a very similar walkway system is in Hong Kong, which started to be built in the 1970s and continues to be expanded into recent decades, with some parts done by the government. Let's return to Western Europe and into France, which is a country where it's really difficult to pick examples as the elevated pedestrian infrastructure is absolutely everywhere, from projects of the 60s forward. Unlike North America and the UK, except the Barbican estate, I guess, we can find larger and more complex modernist projects in France that usually go beyond just single block. Let's look at one project from the center of Bordeaux from the 70s and 80s. This is actually very close to that original idea of pedestrian space in the sky in a city of the future, divided from the traffic below. On the ground, there is pretty much a classic city grid, and the whole development just seems like it floats above it. This is not just a residential estate. I would say it's maybe not an estate at all. There is of course high emphasis on residential towers, but one block is entirely taken by a mall. There are hotels, since we are in the center of Bordeaux, some sports buildings, library, and so on. The ground level is reserved for the infrastructure, cars, buses, and trams. This means that the ground level only sees mostly entrances to garages, occasional shop, entrances to the upper levels, but otherwise it's mostly a concrete wall. This is clearly telling you that you are not supposed to be down below as a pedestrian because you are supposed to enjoy your designated place on the upper level. This place is overall quite fascinating from the engineering point of view, but of course, reality of living inside it or around it may or may not be something else. Now, I want to show you this place in Paris, just a couple of blocks away from the Eiffel Tower. A 1967 magazine shows how Paris was supposed to look in 20 years. Notice those open decks, terraces, podiums, plazas in the sky, however you want to call them. Very similar to Bordeaux previously, but in this drawing, of course, much more extensive, connecting many different blocks, since that is kind of the main principle, the main point, so people don't need to set foot on the ground level at all. Of course, this was not built, and today in this place there are various towers with many different elevated yet smaller streets, corridors, plazas, or sports grounds. So in a way, something similar to Calgary, but smaller. Just a little stop in the suburbs of Paris to look at this place. In London, the Barbican estate was a very artistic, decorated, and highly unique area. Calgary was a skyway connecting various city blocks of various styles. Bordeaux were also city blocks, but more interconnected with a more unified style. Now, we have relatively ordinary modernist residential estates of prefabricated towers, but with the elevated pedestrian infrastructure. It mostly serves as a cover for parking lots and technical stuff inside of the estates. This is also once again a perfect example of the modernist functional separation and mostly rejection of classic streets. All the outside life is supposed to happen inside the block, between the chaotically positioned towers, on top of the multi-level plazas. Transportation function is strictly divided on the outside. The elevated pedestrian levels continue into a very large office and commercial block, from which it continues into another estate and a transit hub. There is also another estate, but it seems to be disconnected from the elevated network. But this one also crosses the road, has many levels, and connects to some amenities inside of the estate. Also, interesting how education is put on the very edges of the estates. This is actually what we have seen in Hungary in that urban design evolution video. It's just interesting to spot the same elements in different countries, and it only illustrates how modernist urbanism was just everywhere at the time. It's just completely wrong to narrow it down and call it Soviet architecture or something. It's just nonsense. Example from Finland of a very similar design, perhaps a little more uniform. Also notice that almost urban highway nearby, which just completes the 70s aesthetic. The elevated deck also serves as a cover for parking lot mostly. It covers a street as well and provides a multi-level public area. It is mostly paved with small planters, occasional playground benches, but that's it. One huge principal, general aspect of this idea is that the whole deck can be thought of like a front path towards the door. Once you enter the deck, you are in the structure, not on the street in front of the structure in a way. This was actually described roughly in the 1960s as a possible way forward in urban design, to simply build almost cyberpunk-like mega blocks, single building instead of an estate that you would enter directly when stepping off a train and then just walked inside towards your flat. Well, we have almost seen that today, didn't we? With the Park Hill flats in Sheffield. So there is some continuity and expansion of these ideas. Of course, proper mega blocks were never built. There were technically fascinating plans for some in Czechoslovakia and possibly elsewhere. Maybe I should focus on that in a different video, but I digress as always. Moving on, let's return home to Central Europe. Wrocław in Poland, and a project I think I showed in that architectural introduction to the 1960s. This place is known mostly for the towers, but there is also that shiny new Sky Plaza with shops. Below that are simple garages and loading bays, similar to Bordeaux in France. Here I think we need to notice two things. First, you really are supposed to use that elevated place. The street down below only has a tiny sidewalk, along which you have a beautiful view into a decaying abandoned parking garage. Not great. Second thing, the elevated part truly only serves the tower project, nothing more, and actually not even all of the towers. There are clearly older blocks around, so those cannot even be connected to any sky infrastructure, which is exactly the same problem as in the city of London. Now let's take a look at a couple of projects that were never built. This is a 1969 plan for the center of Warsaw. Notice that right in the middle there is the famous Socialist Realism Palace of Culture and Science, but all around it would be a total modernist rework. Notice all the black main avenues and huge intersections with even some great separation. Above that would be the pedestrian infrastructure, completely divided from the ground, as the streets in the sky would not even follow the same path as roads, but rather continue into buildings, elevated plazas, and so on. This network for pedestrians was never built, but the roads and avenues were. Other pictures of the same area, but for different concepts. This angle shows much better the planned sky plazas, stairs, multiple levels, entrances, and so on and so on. This just shows how insanely complex some of these places could have been. The place in Finland somewhat illustrated the direction, but the architects had far greater ideas. In the previous video, I showed you that Czechoslovak architect's vision for the new development in Bratislava. I mostly talked about roads, but of course the pedestrian separation is an inseparable part of that too, so we can look at the same picture. Just focus on different elements. This is exactly what I was hinting earlier. Concepts for huge buildings that would themselves serve as an entire estate all in one. And of course, all of that interconnected with the streets in the sky, over the highways, into shopping malls, to elevated plazas, and so on. None of that was ever built. And let's end our journey in Prague. Maybe I should have started the video with this one because this shows perfectly what the architects wanted to achieve. You have cars tucked underneath, and all the walking, shopping, and just chilling happens on top. The paved open space is gigantic. This is thanks to that modernist idea of housing people on a small footprint, but in very tall buildings, so there's plenty of space below, and the building is not fighting for light and air with its neighbors. But the scale of the plazas is perhaps influenced by the Eastern Bloc's ideology. We will explore that in the very next video. The reality is somewhat different. Standard prefabricated concrete flats were of course used, and nothing from the vertical separation was built, except a sunken entrance to the metro station at the end. Now we will look at these 70s places that I visited and took pictures of. The first is a building that architecturally heavily inspires what I'm building here in the background. You already must see the resemblance, that aluminium outline cantilevered outside and bridging the two buildings, the modernist light facade, and that somewhat brutalist concrete crown on top. All of that I'm including in my build. But this building also shows some attempt to provide its own pedestrian infrastructure separated from cars, but it quite badly fails. Once again, if you are standing on the street, there is not much to look at, a concrete wall. The design doesn't want you to be on the street. Street doesn't exist. There is only road and your designated pedestrian place, which is on the other side of that front wall. Problem is, that place doesn't continue anywhere. It's just a tiny plaza. If you leave it in one direction, you are at an ugly loading bay for a Tesco. If you climb the stairs, you are at a parking lot. It's overall quite strange, as if the building doesn't want you to visit it from directions other than arriving by a car or by metro and resurfacing at the tiny plaza. Perhaps I'm overthinking this tiny area, maybe it doesn't show these things at all, but maybe it can be a little example of that utopian vision of the future, which was simply not continued further, and it remains a small fragment. Going all the way to the edge of Prague, we reach the South City development that I mentioned 2 episodes back, and I probably will in the future too. But today I want to focus on the commercial complex at the end of the metro line. It is similar to what we saw before, with the same exact problems. If you exit the metro station below in this direction, you have to enter this building whether you like it or not, whether you want to climb down to the streets or not. From here, you can go in any direction, but you cannot really shake the feeling that the whole project is just unfinished. This sad little overpass doesn't go anywhere, even though it is featured in numerous old photos and even movies, as if it's some highlight of the place. Some other paths will take you into places where you feel like you're not supposed to be in, like staring at loading ramps, once again. You know, the technical areas that were probably supposed to be hidden from sight in these kinds of designs. Or you can continue into the mall or into the long, proper street in the sky. This area is multi-level, mostly paved space with tall residential buildings on one side and amenities on the other. Perhaps a little tight, but if you imagine it new, maybe not so bad. But then you reach the end and, well, nothing. Long stairs down, ramp, and a very out-of-place looking modern elevator. Not even another overpass over the main avenue. So you actually need to go down to the ground level and observe the complex from the ground. And this is exactly the same problem we could have seen in the other projects. It just looks terrible, and it doesn't really work with where you are at all. You cannot enter the structure from the street because, well, street doesn't exist. It's just a road. You are supposed to be up there, not down here. All you see are some loading bays, parking garage openings, and walls, and the shop facades at the top without even seeing their entrances. Just another fragment, which in this particular place might also be the result of different project teams working on different spots of the estate without following a single vision. I guess we have seen enough of these examples, various plans and final executions. So overall, how can we conclude this? Let's summarize the facts and observations. Historically, in the Western world mostly, there were many social problems attributed to the streets in the sky. Plenty of reading about that. Although, as you can read, it overlaps with the question of just high-density housing. Eastern Bloc situation was somewhat different in that regard, but that is seriously a whole different topic. Overall, there is also that ever-present forced nature of the separation and the expected paths you should take or things you should do. It is that highly planned engineering or scientific approach to the living environment, which is very strong in modernism. Accessibility is very poor, worse in some compared to others, but overall the 60s and 70s were not exactly known for providing easily accessible ways. The whole aesthetic of the places is another thing. We saw in the various projects how the elevated plazas were mostly paved, and the designs inevitably ended up with various corners, dead ends, unnatural openings, and so on, where people simply don't go, despite the architect's vision. So those places then feel redundant, abandoned, strange, and that also invites decay. Not necessarily through vandalism, even though that is also present, but just pure neglect through apathy for a place people don't like, either consciously or subconsciously. But that ties to the overall idea of living environment should shape behavior, or something like that. But of course, there is the danger of an extreme, where the living environment uses a jackhammer to shape you. Well, getting a little philosophical there. Anyway, in the practical world, despite ideologies, places need to be built and maintained with money. And this is where most of the utopian visions hit a brick, or rather concrete, wall. Simple as that. In the Eastern Bloc more than in the West. The elevated infrastructure is just astronomically more expensive than a simple sidewalk or painted crosswalk. And then there is maintenance. Same problem with that. Instead of a simple sidewalk, you have to maintain the supporting structure, deck, waterproofing, railings, stairs, elevators, artificial patches of grass, tiling. You get the idea. This is a big problem today for the existing projects. Not enough money for maintenance, not enough money for demolition, no consensus for a fix. In the end, would it be better if some of the plans were completed, just a little more or even fully? Well, that really depends. Would it be better to have an overpass crossing a major avenue from an already established elevated commercial plaza? Would it be better if this elevated infrastructure allowed 50-lane highway below? Is the vertical infrastructure a very elaborate idea for just cynically making way for more lanes and parking spaces? Perhaps it is, but perhaps it also highly depends on the location, project, local social aspects, and everything else. Let's now jump into the time-lapse. Okay, so let's describe this building that I'm doing in Altengrad. So, as you could have seen, I started with getting rid of that construction site, so I just have completely clean area to build, and then I also continued demolishing some other city blocks around here. Now, this is not exactly what I planned at first, and I suppose that lore-wise in Altengrad, I am kind of justifying it with also thinking that some of the city blocks were perhaps damaged during the war, so some of the buildings were not exactly in like the top shape, even though we can also see cities in Central Europe where the buildings were okay-ish and they were demolished anyway to just make way for new architecture. So we can think of either one of these approaches in Altengrad. It doesn't really matter. What matters is that the center of Altengrad is going to be heavily reworked with this new modernist architecture. So I built first that little white model using those cubes from procedural objects because this entire area required some serious planning beforehand. I could not just go in here and just slap some random structures on some corners because this place needed to make sense as a whole. So it was absolutely essential to just plan it in advance very heavily so it would just turn out looking okay, yeah? But we are not going to complete it today. Today I'm only going to complete this building, this complex of buildings, I suppose you can look at it that way. And in the very next episode, we are going to wrap it up by building a large plaza, the largest in the city by far, with some additional modern buildings around it and some shiny new details. So it's going to look completely different than the rest of the city. So this central area of the city is going to be heavily reworked, as I said, but because Altengrad is kind of a big city already, like in the game right now, even though, like I mentioned many times, I consider it to be like larger, but in the game it's scaled down, but still it is pretty large. So even if we demolish some of these inner city blocks and then we zoom out and look at the finished place, the entire feel of the city is not really going to be affected that much. It's just this central area that's going to be completely reworked, yeah? And together with obviously all the highways, urban highways, new avenues and things, Sure, it's definitely going to feel different, it's going to look different, but it's not going to look that much different. Yeah, that's kind of what I'm trying to say. And I can safely say that we are not going to touch the very old town of Altengrad. Yeah, we are only going to work on these outer areas, pretty much outside the very old medieval city walls, like I built them or indicated them in some earlier episodes of the series. Yeah, so something like that. That's kind of the plan. As you can see, I'm using procedural objects to put all of this together because there was no other way. There is nothing like this in the workshop, and the building is absolutely gigantic, and at the same time it needs to be very well fitting to this area that I prepared for it. And not just that, because it's not just like an office and commercial complex, but it's also going to work together with various elevations and the new train station entrance. Because if you remember last time, we built the highway, which cut off access to the old train station building, the historical building. So now we have to prepare a new one, new entrance, which is going to go below the highway. So that's exactly that little sunken area that I'm preparing down here, and where I built that big sign Altengrad with procedural objects letters. Yeah. Now, the donor for this facade is actually the Park Inn Hotel in Berlin. So that's another modernist building that was built in Berlin. I believe it was finished in 1970 or something. This facade might be the refurbished version, but it looks very similar to some other facades of the era, so it doesn't really matter. It's actually perfect for my purposes, and especially because the model of that building is super simple. It only has a couple of vertices really, and this is the entire texture of it. So very easy to work with. It's just a facade box, nothing more. And then I'm heavily adding all of these procedural objects, cubes, that I'm reshaping into all of these rectangles and just walls, faces, and adding my own textures to them so that they have some different materials. I downloaded a couple of new textures from textures.com, I believe, but I'm also using some from the workshop, some kind of tiles as well, and all kinds of different surfaces. I'm especially satisfied with this concrete texture that I managed to get for these big walls, because this looks like the typical surface finish that you can find on many different projects in Central Europe from this time period. In Central Europe, you usually don't find raw concrete finishes, unlike, for example, Britain or France. Now, there is also this outline, this golden aluminium outline around the entire project. So we have seen that at the Centrotex building. Again, I'm trying to actually copy it somewhat one-to-one, although the building is completely different shape, obviously, but the dimensions are roughly the same, and even the color. At first I just put some sort of shiny yellow color that was obviously not gonna stay, but I just used it to see the shapes a little bit better and just construct it. And then I can just select it all and change the color to this like dark gold or somewhat brownish color, I suppose it eventually turned out, but it's a good contrast to some of the other colors, and at the same time it works well with the blue of the facade, so that's nice. I was definitely trying to think about the entire palette of this project. Yeah. Now, this entire project is going to consist of 3 parts, but they are going to be interconnected by the aluminium outline, yeah, just like the Centrotex building. Even though that one was made of 2, this one is going to be made of 3. I suppose that this is a good time to mention some other inspirations for this project. So I was taking, for example, inspirations from the Alpha complex in Poznań, Poland, then the Hotel Kiev in Bratislava. It's a hotel as well as a shopping mall. It looks very, very similar to that tallest portion of this entire build, and the Centrotex building, of course, that is the main inspiration. And for the entrance to the new train station, that's taken from Prague, Maine, because like I mentioned with the highways are already inspired by that area, so the new entrance to the train station also must be inspired by that. Now, when we were looking at the pictures of the Centrotex building, I mentioned that I'm also going to include that concrete crown on top of the building, because It just looks really interesting, kind of unnecessary on top of the building, of course. It's some sort of a decoration, but this lowest portion of the complex was looking a little bare on top, so I decided that this one is going to receive the crown. Now, by the way, all three of these buildings are made of the same Park-Inn hotel from Berlin, from the facade. I mean, the facade is the same, so that is somewhat unified, but the overall detailing around is going to be somewhat different. Yeah, so this one is going to get the crown. Otherwise, it's going to get some concrete like outline and some sort of vertical elements at the entrance. It's also going to receive that ramp and stairs. By the way, the ramp. This is a direct inspiration from the Hotel Kiev in Bratislava, but unfortunately the ramp is way too steep. It's like 4 times as steep as the norms allow it to, so I actually had to get rid of it. It's going to be in the cinematics, but in the next episode I will get rid of it and put stairs there. The ramp just cannot work because the real-life building puts the staircase to the bottom of that second level, yeah? But I'm making it go to the terrace, so it goes much, much higher. So we cannot really afford to have a ramp there. But the middle building, the shortest one with the crown, it's probably some kind of a shopping mall, so it would definitely have escalators inside, even in this time period, perhaps even elevators already. So that's not really that big of a deal that we don't have the ramp on the outside. And at the end of the day, it's kind of realistic. Like I mentioned before, accessibility was not exactly taken care of in the 70s. Now, this third part, that's going to be directly inspired by the tall Hotel Kiev in Bratislava. It's like a dominant of that part of the city. Now, by the way, one thing that the Hotel Kiev and Alpha complex in Poznań, they have in common is that they are built on a side of like a larger old city block. I'm not really sure if buildings were demolished because of the projects or there were just some gaps left after the war or something like that. But what they have in common is that they are right on the side of the old buildings. You have some old buildings that are just staring directly into the wall of these new structures. It's looking kind of weird. Especially in Bratislava, there are also like a couple of buildings that clearly had or were supposed to have some sort of neighbors right next to them, glued right next to them, wall to wall, but that was either demolished or never built, something like that. And right now you have some weird remnants of old buildings just around these new projects. It's looking kind of strange, as if maybe there were supposed to be some different plans, maybe it was never built, never continued, the demolitions maybe never continued, or something like that. So it's looking in the end a little out of place. So that's probably something that we will have in Altengrad as well. Then I was doing that train station entrance, as you could have seen. It was nothing special. It's just like a concrete top with the sign saying Altengrad. It's a little sunken because it's at the same level as the tram stop that we did previously, I believe. And then there are just some huge stairs going down towards it. Now, the initial idea here was that, unlike Prague, I really wanted to do it so that if you are standing on that like an open space in front of the complex and you look at the direction of the station, you will see that old station building. Yeah, it's not going to be obstructed. So I really wanted to put the new entrance a little bit lower, a little sunken, so that it's not going to observe the view too much. You are going to, unfortunately, see the highway, see the traffic on it. Maybe there's going to be some more noise coming into the plaza because of the highway. Who knows? Yeah, but I think that visually it definitely turned out looking okay. And this is the huge change that is happening right now in the city. So a couple of blocks were torn down, but as you can see even from these cinematics, the entire feel of the city is not gonna be like super massively changed, yeah, because there are just so many of these older city blocks, and we are obviously not going to touch like all of them, yeah. Most of them are going to remain in the city, even though there might be some more additional demolitions. I already hinted some with the highways, even though I am slightly changing my mind right now, so we will see where it's going to take us. So these are the cinematics. As you can see, I just quickly whipped up that construction site for the next project because, like I said, I don't really want to keep it empty for the cinematics to kind of show the somewhat realistic progress. And also, we don't have any people using the terraces, the streets in the sky in this complex. And at the same time, there are no people going to the new train station building right now because I really don't want to bother with the pedestrian infrastructure until we have the rest of the area done. And I already did it, so I can tell you that the pedestrian infrastructure looks really good. People are using all the stairs, all the elevated stuff. They are going into all of these buildings using all the places that we are going to prepare for them. So that's kind of going to be maybe a little bit different how it would be in real life. In real life, people would probably pick some kind of preferred paths and took them through these heavily engineered areas. But who knows? This is Altengrad. This is kind of just fiction, right? Anyway, thank you guys for watching today's episode. Hope you liked it. If you did, then please do all the usual things below the video, all the clicking, writing, commenting, these kinds of things, sharing, subscribing. And if you like this a lot, you can become a channel member and directly support me in what I'm doing here. Thank you guys so much for the support that you are giving me right now. Thank you. Goodbye.